It took years to understand that it wasn't commitment, it was actually the absence of recovery, rhythm, and regeneration. So, regenerative leadership is multidisciplinary by design. It's the integration, not any single discipline, that creates change that actually lasts. And over time, these threads and disciplines formed a system, a living architecture that leaders can actually use. Welcome to the Leadership Longevity Podcast. I'm Elizabeth Hughes, and I'm genuinely glad you're here. Here's what I believe. Leadership isn't a performance, it's a practice. And the practice you choose determines the life you get to live. This space is for leaders who are tired, not in a defeated way, but in a done with the old model way. Tired of quick fixes, tired of the constant urgency, tired of feeling like they're supposed to sprint a marathon and somehow call it success. Here we're building something different. Systems that actually sustain you. Systems built on health, on rhythm, on lived legacy. So if you want leadership that lasts, leadership that doesn't cost you your health, your relationships, or your sense of self, you're exactly where you need to be. What we're doing here is simple, but not small. We're exploring a way of leading anchored in mindful presence, strengthened by courage and generosity, and sustained by health as a very infrastructure of influence. Legacy isn't something you write at the end. It's something you live in your decisions, in your rhythms, your relationships, and in the culture you shape around you. Leadership is being stretched in ways we've never seen. Tenures are shorter, cognitive load is heavier, teams are exhausted, and even brilliant, committed leaders are burning out faster than they're rising. So here's the truth. The leadership model we inherited wasn't built for the world we're living in. We've normalized urgency, we've glorified endurance, and we've been mistaken speed for clarity. We've built systems that reward depletion and call it dedication. And leaders feel it. They feel it in their bodies, in their relationships, their decision-making, and their sense of self. The world doesn't need more tactics. It doesn't need another productivity hack. It doesn't need more noise. It needs a truth. It needs rhythm. It needs leaders who can sustain their influence and not just survive their roles. That's why this podcast exists now, because regenerative leadership isn't a luxury. It's essential. And before we go any further, I want to say this clearly. This series is a gift. It's a gift to every leader who steps into the arena each day. Yes, I work with senior executives, but this is also for the leaders who don't have a title, who don't sit at the top of the org chart, but who shape culture quietly and profoundly. This podcast is for them, for you, and for all of us who believe that leadership can be regenerative, compassionate, and built to last. And if we're going to walk this path together, you deserve to know the lineage of this work and the lived experience behind it. So I'm the founder of the Mindful Executive and the architect of the Leadership Longevity Ecosystem, a regenerative leadership system designed to embed rhythm, health, and legacy into everyday practice. Leadership longevity isn't accidental. It's designed. And like most meaningful work, I didn't arrive here through theory. I arrived here through 3 separate threads of lived experience that eventually wove themselves into one philosophy. The first thread was the mindful executive. So I was mid-career, mother of a young child, working across corporates, SMEs. I'd worked in remote Australia and overseas. And we'd just returned from Canada, and I was leading a team of organisational psychologists and career transition specialists. And it was a role when I first became an executive coach. And interestingly, I was facing the very challenges I was supporting others through. A little bit of a classic plumber's leaky pipe situation. So preparing for whatever came next, I completed an AICD course, which many young budding directors do here in Australia, and joined a not-for-profit board, and in a move that surprised even me, became a yoga teacher. Looking back though, none of this was random. It was the beginning of integrating strategy, leadership, and health into one coherent way of being. The second thread was when I walked alongside leaders through transitions, when they were working in or with dysfunctional teams, handling board pressures, navigating media crises, or during periods of rapid and unrelenting change or growth. Quite often we'd solve the immediate issue, stabilise the fires, but quite often we would actually circle back to the deepest sticking points that needed more rhythm, more attention, more intention. A different approach was needed, a regenerative one. And then finally, the third thread was my own narrative. And this thread stretches back to my childhood and adolescence, as so many of our narratives do. So when I was 14, I was prescribed Valium to loosen the muscles in my jaw, muscles clenched so tightly from working on a school assignment over a holiday break that I could barely open my mouth. So even back then, I learned something that I didn't yet have the language for, which was that performance without rhythm has a cost, and pushing without recovery becomes its own kind of injury. And yes, the body does keep score long before the mind catches up. So I grew up with this quiet narrative that performance was dangerous, that excellence and erosion traveled together. So I'd throw myself into things with everything I had and then pull back. The moment my health began to fray, a little too much or a little too little. Never the integration, never the rhythm. It took years to understand that it wasn't commitment or a lack thereof. It wasn't laziness or anything else that my inner critic wanted to throw at me. It was actually the absence of recovery, rhythm, and regeneration. So across the three threads of integration, observation, and personal transformation came the foundation of the mindful executive, and then the architecture for the ecosystem, which is at the heart of this podcast. This work is shaped, too, by the disciplines that shaped me: mindfulness, neuroscience, physiology, systems thinking, coaching psychology, and the lived wisdom of leaders I've worked beside for years. And of course, the performance coaching that's reshaped my own leadership longevity more recently. So regenerative leadership is multidisciplinary by design. It's the integration, not any single discipline, that creates change that actually lasts. And over time, these threads and disciplines formed a system, a living architecture that leaders could actually use. Before we go any further, though, I want to give you a bit of a feeling for the world that we're actually going to be working inside. So leadership isn't a role. It's an ecosystem, a living system that shapes your capacity, your clarity, your relationships, and the conditions then that others inherit. A system made up of your biology, psychology, relationships, your transitions, the wider conditions you're leading within. The full ecosystem that shapes your long arc as a leader. So when this ecosystem is healthy, leadership feels grounded, clear, and sustainable. But when it's strained, everything just becomes so much harder than it needs to be. So this podcast is about restoring the conditions that make longevity possible so that leaders don't cost you your health, your clarity, or your life outside of work. But even the strongest ecosystem is shaped by pressure. And under pressure, something else shows up. Every leader knows resistance. It's the tightening you feel when your behavior is challenged, the hesitation that rises when a belief is questioned, and the instinct to pull back when something feels like it's just going to be hard work. So as we move through this season's 12 myths, you may notice this arise more than once. It's not a flaw. It's your identity during its job. It's your system trying to protect the version of you it still believes it needs to be. And it's biological too. Your brain is a prediction machine. It prefers the familiar, even when the familiar is exhausting. So when you try to lead differently, your system pushes back, not because the change is wrong, but because it violates the old forecast. Most leaders are taught to push through resistance, not to interpret it, to override it, not to understand what it's trying to protect. But when resistance goes unexamined, it pulls leaders back into predictable patterns that feel personal, but are actually systemic. These are the patterns that I call survivor drivers. Across every leader I've worked with, there are 4 predictable patterns, including me, by the way, 4 predictable patterns that show up under pressure. They're not character flaws, they're survival responses. The system teaches us. And they quietly shape everything: your longevity, your leadership, your legacy, and your sense of freedom. Let me give you a feel for each. The first pattern, the health depletion pattern, is the one that convinces you to trade your biology for performance, to push, override, and endure because you believe you have to. And when your biology is compromised, the way you lead is compromised too. The second driver is the influence distortion pattern. The pattern that mistakes speed for clarity, authority for presence, authority for influence, and holding on for stability. So when influence becomes distorted, the way you move through change becomes distorted too. The third survival driver is the transition avoidance pattern. And this pattern treats transitions as threats, moments to resist, deny, or fear. And so when transitions are avoided, legacy gets pushed further and further away. And then finally, the fourth driver, the deferred legacy pattern. So this pattern is the one that postpones meaning, impact, and freedom until some imagined later. When you see these survival drivers together, you start to recognize the deeper truth, is that leaders aren't taught to regenerate within leadership. They're taught to survive it. This season is about changing that. It's about restoring the ecosystem that makes longevity, leadership, legacy, and liberation possible. And in the next episode, we'll begin exploring the myths that keep these survival drivers in place. The stories leaders inherit, absorb, and repeat without ever realizing the cost. So here's what you can expect from this podcast: regenerative health, adaptive influence, lived legacy, and leadership liberation. You'll hear solo reflections, leader conversations, expert insights, myth-busting sessions, and practical renewal tools. Every episode blends science, story, and lived leadership to help you build a career, a culture, and a legacy that can actually last. And later in the season, we'll step into the full leadership longevity ecosystem, the architecture that holds every myth, every pattern, and every horizon. This podcast isn't just about listening. It's about redesigning the way you lead. So take a moment. Think about the rhythms shaping your leadership right now. What's serving you? And what's draining you? And what's asking to be reimagined? This is the beginning of a new chapter, one where leadership becomes regenerative, where health becomes infrastructure, and where legacy becomes something you live. I'm Elizabeth Hughes. Welcome to the Leadership Longevity Podcast. Let's begin.